Hello there, I'm Brian Goulet of the Goulet Pen Company, and I'm here for another episode of Goulet Q&A. This is number 27. It's hard to believe it's that many already, but I'm having a good time doing them, and you guys keep asking questions, so I'm back here once again. Following up now, it's going to be tough to follow up after last week, because last week I did an interview with Nathan Tardif of Noodlers Inc. It was really cool. If you haven't seen it, go check that one out, because there's not a lot of stuff documented about Nathan and his thoughts. And I've got the last interview I did with him was, gosh, a couple of years ago. So it's really kind of cool to catch up with him. I speak to him on the phone on a somewhat regular basis, but he's a really interesting guy. Really has a cool kind of story. So go check that one out. I've been really busy with a lot of stuff. Rachel and I attended a leadership boot camp last week through the University of Richmond here. That was really cool. Really reinforced that we're doing a lot of things really well. If you interact with Goulet Pen Company at all, you know that we have kind of our own way of doing things, but we got a lot of things. We got some stuff to work on, but we're really kind of doing good. So now that we've got a team of more than 20 people here, we are trying to kind of step up our own game in terms of our leadership and management and stuff like that, because it's not like the early days, 3 or 4 years ago when it was just Rachel and I, and we didn't have to think too much about how we were affecting other people within the company because it was just the two of us. But nowadays we think about that kind of stuff a lot. We're also going to be taking a business trip next week, so the time that I've had to spend doing videos has been a little bit fewer and further between, and so I'm sorry that my video load has been a little bit lower, and in fact I'm going to have to cancel next week's Q&A as well, just giving you a heads up now about it, just because I'm going to be out of town for several days, and so I want to make sure that I'm tending to the other business things that I need to. But I promise after that, get back into the swing of things here. So that said, I've got a pretty stacked Q&A for you today. It's going to be an open forum. So I got all kinds of questions. I got 18 great questions here, and I'm going to cover them as thoroughly as I can while trying to be concise and move things along. So first of all, the first question I have is Tyler A, also Tristan N on Facebook said, I'd really like to know how to make a scratchy nib less scratchy. Now they both had kind of different questions, but it was kind of fell under this umbrella of how do you make a scratchy nib write smoother. So I thought I would just kind of cover that in a general format here. So this should cover most everybody who's got a scratchy nib. So the first thing to do when you got a scratchy nib is check the alignment, because the way that a fountain pen nib works is you've got two tines and the ink flows in between those tines. Well, if you are looking straight at the nib, if one of them is up or one of them is down, then as you're moving it across the page, one of them is going to be lower and it's going to dig more into the paper. It's going to make it feel scratchy. So a lot of times just getting those aligned again will make the thing write smoother. And you can do that just with your fingernails. Okay, you don't need any special tools or anything like that. And if you check my video on the Goulet loop, that is the best representation I have, because I show you how to use the loop and also how to check for that alignment on there. It's pretty neat. So check that one out. If that alignment doesn't do it and you actually have like a nib grinding issue, you may be able to fix that yourself with micromesh or mylar. I have separate videos on those, a Goulet mylar video and a Goulet micromesh video, and I show you in detail how to do that with a kind of a figure eight movement. It's just a couple materials that you need that's pretty straightforward to do, and you can fix most issues yourself if you're comfortable doing that. Also a good resource, Stephen Brown, he's another good YouTube guy, a friend of mine, fellow video blogger. So he's got a video called Nib Smoothing, so you can check his out and see what his approach is there. So I'd recommend you do that too. And of course, you can always send it to a professional if you're not comfortable doing any of that stuff yourself. Serah E on Facebook said, is it possible for Goulet Pens to use different shipping companies instead of USPS? Love the company and people there. I'm assuming you mean us, not USPS. And would really love to support it more often, but the shipping to Singapore is really scary. Okay, so you're talking about shipping internationally with USPS. I will admit that is not a particular strength of theirs. Believe it or not, they're actually pretty reliable, at least with the stuff that we're sending out. We're sending, a lot of packages by US mail, and the reliability has been pretty darn good. Believe me, we wouldn't be using them if it wasn't, you know, a pretty high degree of reliability. You know, they're not perfect, but then nobody is. However, internationally is probably one of their biggest weaknesses. Now, I will say we've checked out UPS and FedEx and some of the other ones, and they are very expensive internationally. However, they deliver faster, and they go through customs quicker and all that. So you get what you pay for, really, is what it boils down to. However, with UPS and FedEx, you have to have accounts set up there. There's computer system stuff involved that requires a lot of time and effort to set up. So currently, we're not set up for either of them. So everything we ship has to be through US mail. Especially international. So we're not able to do that now. We're currently investigating some of our options. However, we got a lot of irons in the fire. That hasn't been one of our biggest pain points there. I know it would be nice to have options there, but you know, especially given the fact that it would cost so much more on your end to ship things by UPS or FedEx, it hasn't been something that we've had like an overwhelming response for so far. So a lot of people think that the shipping is too expensive as it is. So, you know, it's something we're exploring, and we'll continue to look into that. Travis W on Facebook, what's the deal with Oragnics Studio? What's special or different about the brand? Okay, so Oragnics Studio is an ink line that we just recently picked up about a month or two ago. It's actually, if you know the history of the brand at all, you know that we picked it up a couple of years ago when the ink first came out. It's made in Maryland here in the United States by a gentleman named Tyler Thompson. He's actually a senior in college and he is a chemistry major there. So he's going to be graduating pretty soon. He's been making the ink for a couple of years. We had touched base with him a while ago because, you know, we got our start kind of small and entrepreneurial, and so we were like, oh, we'll reach out to him. He took him a little while to kind of figure things out with his ink, and so we started carrying him, and then we didn't carry him anymore because he was reformulating some inks and stuff like that. And we were like, you know, why don't you go ahead and figure that stuff out, and then we'll talk later. Well, we talked later, and now we picked his stuff back up because he's developed quite a few inks. He's got about 30 inks in his lines now, and the main line of his inks is based on the elements. So if you think about the periodic table elements, you know, it's a chemistry thing. He's got like carbon and boron and copper and stuff like that. So it's all colors kind of based on the elements, and they're all relatively conventional inks, a little more like European style inks. So a little bit more watered down, I guess, if you could say that, as opposed to like the punchy like Noodler's inks and stuff. However, he does have some inks that have some unique properties to them. So like Charles Darwin, the HMS Beagle, and Santiago Bay Blue, those are all fast drying inks, great for left-handers. They will absorb more into the paper though, so the reviews are not particularly great on those inks because I don't think most people are aware of what those properties are, but they're made to dry really fast, which they do. And then Aristotle is an iron gall ink. Isaac Newton, Accident Blue, those are both pigmented and permanent inks. Gregor Mendel is a pigmented chlorophyll-based ink, and then Blue Merle is a vintage ink that's meant to be kind of easy maintenance. So it's got some interesting properties there. You can always check out Oragnics Studio. They have a website as well where you can read a little bit more about the development of those inks. But that's kind of the basic rundown. I haven't done a video or anything yet, but then, you know, I've been really sparse on my videos in general lately, and to tackle a whole brand like that, I'm kind of like waiting to form my thoughts together and figure out how to get that one across. But that at least gives you a basic overview. Alan L. on Facebook said, what's the best notebook to mix with school and fountain pen use? Right now I like to use a Moleskine, but they're too pricey to be used with school. But I also don't want to subject my pens to cheaply made notebook paper. This is a tough one because you always got the blend here between, or the balance, I guess, of I want good paper, but I don't want to pay a lot for it. And it's really hard to find that balance, especially if you're talking about something that's in a notebook format. I haven't found great success with those, honestly. I mean, Staples has some, I believe, was it Eco, or it used to be their Bagasse or whatever it was called. I don't think it's called that anymore. It's called like the Ecosystem or something. I've heard stuff about that. I've never used it personally, but I've heard pretty good reviews of that. Moleskine I've not had good experiences with personally, and it's expensive. Clairefontaine has some good stuff. They got some wire-bound options that are a little more economical. They're not cheap by any means. They're going to cost you about 4 times what a regular, you know, American crappy paper notebook would cost you. But you know, that's definitely an option. I mean, Clairefontaine paper is superb. So that's some of my favorite stuff. Kathy V on Facebook. How do you pick the right paper? Some are thick, some are colored, and some soak up the ink and bleeds. All right, so you're not talking about using for school or anything like that, but you're talking about just paper in general. Well, I'll say if you're in the US here, which I don't really know where you're from, but I'm just going to assume, just because that's where most of my fan base is here, most paper in the US sucks pretty bad. It really does, because fountain pen ink is just not a consideration for most of these companies. And a lot of the printers we have are inkjet printers, which absorb ink, and then you've got ballpoint or gel rollerball pens, which do fine on absorbent paper. So most paper is pretty absorbent, and fountain pen ink feathers and bleeds and does all that kind of stuff, and it's just not particularly great. The best thing is to go onto forums, blogs, look at reviews. Like I'm a resource here, I've got some reviews. There's a lot of other bloggers, fountain pen people, it's people you want that are focusing on fountain pens that have done reviews of certain types of paper. That's going to be your best bet, and you're going to need to be kind of like brand centric, because some brands, they do not have consistency within their line. So you might see one review that says, oh, this paper is great, and then the next review, you review the exact same type of notebook, but it's the paper is sourced out from a completely different part of the world, and it's a whole different writing experience, which you would only really notice with a fountain pen, because the other types of pens doesn't really matter. So you gotta be careful, gotta do a little bit of your research. Of course, the best thing to do is to test it with your own ink if you can, but even then it can be frustrating, because like I mentioned, some manufacturers do not source their paper out consistently. It's just not as big a consideration these days as it used to be back when more people were using pens. But the ink can also be a factor as well. So there are certain types of inks and pens and stuff like that that can accommodate better those types of paper. But I know that doesn't help you out tremendously, but paper is a bit of a kind of a grand experiment. And once you find a paper you really like, you tend to want to stick with it. Ben H on Facebook, what is your process for coming up with the ink drop colors every month? That's a good question. Actually, May of 2014, the one that we are going to have coming out here in a couple of weeks, that one is going to be our 45th ink drop. 45th! That's insane. I mean, I had no idea. I don't know how much you know. I mean, a lot of you probably don't even remember Goulet Pen Company back when we started that, because that was pretty early on. We hadn't even been in business for a year when we came up with Ink Drop. It was literally about 3 days from the idea to rolling it out and starting to take membership. I mean, Rachel and I we jumped on the idea, pounded out the logistics right away, figured it out, and the basic formula hasn't really changed a whole lot ever since we came up with it in that 3-day period. And here we are now in our 45th month of Ink Drop. This is crazy, and we've got tons of membership, and I love it. I still love doing it. But I will say that planning it out now is a whole lot different than it used to be back then. We can't plan anything in a 3-day period like we used to, because we've got a lot of moving pieces now with the logistics of everything that needs to be done, and then the number of members that we have is significantly higher than it was back in those days. The amount of ink that we need to use is significantly higher than it used to be. So we have to plan the colors out months in advance. It's rare these days that we can spontaneously come up with an idea. If we do, then it's a lot of logistics that need to be worked out, and we have to rearrange because we've planned out, maybe 6 months in advance. And the reason we do that is to be able to get enough stock, because for any one individual fountain pen ink color, the distributor may not carry that much color, at any one time, because a lot of the colors that we're choosing are kind of random colors that may or may not sell that well, in kind of the grand perspective. We have to really kind of plan it out in advance. So the method that we kind of do is we look back on the colors that we've already used, which at this point is kind of crazy, because like I said, 45th month here. So that's always a bit of a challenge. We really try our absolute best never to repeat a color. Obviously, it's eventually going to get to the point where we have to. I think we may have accidentally repeated once or twice before, but we really try not to. And at this point, there's not that many people that have kind of been hanging on from the beginning. I think we have maybe 10 people that were there from the very beginning, which is still kind of amazing to me. So we look back on the colors we've already used, and then we try not to use anything that we've already done. Usually what we'll do is we'll have kind of an idea or a theme in mind, maybe based on the season, you know, kind of like in the summer months, we'll tend to do things related to shade or bright colors or something like that. So we'll kind of just feel it out, and it's really just kind of based on our own intuition. We've got several of us on our team like to kind of just brainstorm and come up with ideas and theme titles and stuff like that. And then we'll kind of pick inks that we haven't used that kind of match into that theme. Or maybe if it's a theme that has, you know, something, you know, related to it, you know, like a flowery type theme, we'll try and pick inks that are, you know, flowery in name. That gets tougher though, because we've used a lot of inks that have, you know, actual relevant names to any kind of a theme. So these days it's usually more just kind of based on the color itself. And then the last thing is we always choose backup colors, because sometimes we run into stock issues and we don't want to get caught at the last minute without having a color and have it delay the ink drop. So we've very rarely had ink drop actually get delayed. Usually for that, it's because of like holidays and then bad weather and stuff like that, kind of like a series of things that has to happen that delay it by a couple of days. But we've never had like any real significant delay because we plan way in advance. That's a little insight into how ink drop runs there. For any of you not familiar with ink drop, go check it out on gouletpens.com. It's our monthly ink sample program. I probably should have said that up front because I don't know that many of you know what ink drop is. But anyway, if not, now you do. Okay, Ethan J on Facebook. This is a completely random question, Ethan, and I asked some people, okay, well, I'll just go ahead and say the question. He said, could you beat Nick Cage in a fight? Okay, so Nicolas Cage, the actor, could I beat him in a fight? Well, it's funny because some of the people, I mentioned this in one of our stand-up meetings this morning, and the general consensus from everybody was I could totally take Nick Cage in a fight. But me personally, I said, no, I probably couldn't. First off, because I'm a big teddy bear and I'm not a fighter. I've never been in a fight in my life. And I really doubt that like when the moment came, unless I was like defending my kids or my wife or something, like then I would get all, you know, Incredible Hulk. But if it was just like, I'm in a fight, you know, kind of for my own ego's sake, like I really don't think I could take anybody down because I'm not that kind of guy. Now, what I will say is that Nick Cage seems to me like he would be pretty unpredictable in a fight. He seems like kind of a wild guy, kind of spastic, and I don't really know how I'd handle that. So, totally silly question, but, you know, I'm not a fighter. I'm a lover. John J on Facebook says, do you still make pens for fun or have you retired from that? So any of you not familiar, a little backstory here. The way I got into the Goulet Pen Company was I used to make pens. So I used to turn wooden pens by hand on my lathe. And that's why that's why my company name is the Goulet Pen Company, because I was originally a craftsman and I thought, why not? If you're a craftsman, you should name the company after yourself. It's not just because I have a big head and wanted, you know, everybody to do things like Goulet. You know, I literally was like, I was just going to be a craftsman. I never even thought about hiring people and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, back in the early days, I was making pens and I stopped doing that about early 2010, not too far into once I got into the fountain pen thing. As soon as I got into the fountain pen thing, I realized that the way that I was making pens really just kind of didn't work for fountain pens. So I had to kind of give it up just because of space constraints and time constraints and money constraints and really just every constraint out there that you can think in terms of running a business. So I gave that up, and because I really had to give it up. Like, I mean, anyone who started a business, especially because at the time we started the business, I had just had my son. He was literally like a couple months old. And we had just bought a house, so we had a mortgage, and so financially things were a little bit stressful. So I just had all these tools and just pens and all stuff invested into that aspect of the business. And when I wasn't making pens anymore, I had to sell all that stuff off so that we could afford to buy, you know, paper and ink and stuff like that to be able to fund the other part of the business, which is now what we are currently doing. So clearly I made the right call in doing that. However, I had to liquidate a lot of what I was doing in the pen making world. Now I do have some tools and some things, but I've since moved. You know, I took the whole garage over for inventorying stuff, you know, for the retailing side of the business. So I had to completely dismantle my entire workshop. And you can go back and look at some of my older videos and see the process and how hard that really was for me, because man, I was really passionate about making pens, but I had to give it up. And so, I don't know, getting back into it For one, I don't have the space because I've since moved and I don't have a dedicated workshop anymore. So I've got all my tools kind of tucked away in a little shed. It's kind of sad. I do have a strong desire to do woodworking again, probably not in a business capacity of any kind, but really just for my own creative. I really love to work with my hands and love creating stuff. I love working with wood, so I definitely have a desire to do something like wood turning, probably get a decent lathe and start making some bowls and stuff. But really just working with wood, I love doing it, and so I really can't see making pens again, especially in any type of businessy sense. In terms of the woodworking stuff like I used to. But I do think about it from time to time. Geoff P on Facebook. 2 of my Kaweco pens, an extra fine clear classic sport and a medium blue ice sport, both filled as eyedroppers, are leaking out ink through the nib. When I start writing, I find the feed saturated and ink pooling at the sides underneath the nib. My double broad orange ice sport doesn't seem to be doing it. The blue is the worst and often spills out ink onto the paper unless I notice it first and blot it away. Any suggestions? It happens at all ink levels. Well, Geoff, that's a tough one. Kaweco's a toughie because sometimes you just get that with some of these pens. I wish I could tell you exactly what it is that's causing it. I honestly don't know. I know in general when you're working with eyedropper pens, you want to keep the ink level higher, so that the air bubble that's in the pen body is not very substantial, because the more air you have in there, the more likely it is to burp. So that's one thing you want to keep in mind. You mentioned it happens at all ink levels, but that's one thing just for the general public to kind of keep in mind. Why it would be happening with that one and not the other two, I honestly don't have any idea, to be completely honest. It's just tough. Back when I first started carrying Kaweco pens a couple of years ago, before we dropped them for about 1.5 years, I would get comments like this, and I actually shot a video about Kaweco eyedropper troubleshooting, I think it was called. So check that video out because I mentioned some tips on there. But since then, we brought it back, and the stock issues have been, frustrating as far as getting, quantities of anything Kaweco in our hands. But even still, it's the same kind of spotty issues. Now, keep in mind, converting it to an eyedropper, that's not really how the pen was designed, so to speak. It's kind of a hack when you do that. It's a commonly done hack with those pens, given the nature that they don't fit conventional standard international converters. And so a lot of people convert them to eyedropper. But I think because so many people do it, there are these issues that come out, and I wish I could say what it is that causes it. I don't know. It seems to happen kind of randomly, sporadically. I would say that maybe your ink choice may be a factor. Try a different ink. Try cleaning out the pen thoroughly. Try using a different ink and see if that does it. If that still does it, I don't even know what to tell you. You may not want to use it as an eyedropper. That's about the only other option I can give. Jody D on Facebook. I'd like to know if I bought a more expensive Lamy than my Safarian All-Star, would I get a better nib? Don't get me wrong, I love their extra fine nibs, but why spend more? This also applies to pricier Pilot or Platinum pens as opposed to their entry-level pens. Okay, so Jody, I couldn't tell if you meant, should you buy a more expensive Lamy? Well, I guess you said if I bought a more expensive Lamy than my Safarian All-Star. Okay, so there's some pens like the Studio, the CP1, those are slightly more expensive than the Safari and the All-Star. And those are going to have the same nib and feed setup as your Safari and All-Star. So they're going to write exactly the same. The other parts of the pen are going to be different. They're made differently. The Studio especially is, metal, it's heavier, it's got a very different finish on it. So the CP1 is very thin. So that one is going to be a very similar kind of writing experience. Now, there are some of the higher end ones, like there's a Platinum CP1 that was like $400. That was literally a pen made of platinum that had a gold nib on it. And there's also this couple of versions of the Studio that are $150-ish. Those have gold nibs on them. So those are going to write differently than the less expensive pens. The nib looks similar, but it's a 14 karat nib, which is heavenly. Those nibs are awesome. But they're only offered now, currently, I think that CP1 has been discontinued. So I believe it's just 2 different versions of the Studio that now have those 14 karat Lamy nibs. Of course, you've got the Lamy 2000, which is really kind of a different beast altogether. That pen is completely different than all the other ones. It's a piston filling pen. It's got a 14 karat nib on it that's different than the other ones that you get on the Studio. It's got a hooded nib, ink window on it. So that pen is really very different. And that pen is definitely a premium pen. I personally like it more than the Safari and the All-Star. Not that there's anything wrong with the Safari and All-Star. I actually really like those, but you don't necessarily have to spend more money to get a better pen per se. Personally, if you really like your Safari and All-Star, man, just get that. You know, why spend more just to spend more money? You know, more doesn't always mean better. It does for some people. So if it's an issue of the nib not being as smooth, because some people associate cheaper pens with not writing as smoothly, which may or may not be the truth, there are adjustments you can make. I just mentioned that, you know, a couple of questions ago about how to smooth it out. I think that's how I kicked off the video here. The nib softness, that'll make a difference. If you have a gold nib, okay, it will make the nib a little softer, a little springier while you're writing. And the reason is because gold is softer than steel, okay? So if you got a steel nib, like those Lamy nibs are pretty tough. They're pretty, you know, they write like a nail, is how the term is used. The gold nibs, though, are gonna write a little springier, a little softer. And so it's subtle, but you can really feel the difference if you've written with a lot of pens. Some of the pens, the more expensive ones, like specifically you're asking about like Platinum and Pilot and some of those other ones, usually the more expensive pens will have different filling mechanisms that are more expensive, that have a higher ink capacity. So if you got a piston filling pen or maybe a vacuum filling pen, those are gonna have higher ink capacity than a cartridge converter pen would, typically. But that gold nib is the main distinguishing characteristic of the price. If you got a sub, you know, $100 pen, usually it's going to have a steel nib. Once you hit around the $140 range, that's when you get into the Pilot Vanishing Points, the Lamy 2000s, other pens where you get gold nib. Now there's crossover a little bit in between there, but 140, I think that's the cheapest gold nib pen that I'm aware is like the Falcon, the Pilot Vanishing Point. Those are some of the less expensive ones, and I'm a big fan of those. And then when you get into, you know, much more expensive ones, you get into more handwork, artistry, limited editions, you get custom design work and stuff like that, that factor in. You know, I'm thinking specifically with Platinum. It's like their Preppy goes for $4, and they've got, you know, Urushi Maki pens that go up into the thousands of dollars. You know, that's because of the artwork that goes into the actual design of that pen. Rhonda S. on Facebook, is there a customizable notebook with Clairefontaine loose leaf paper? Or does Clairefontaine make a customizable spiral notebook? I love their paper. The French line notebooks are a great price. Okay. So unfortunately, Clairefontaine does not offer loose leaf paper in the US regularly. I have seen it before. I special ordered it way in the early days, like the first couple of months we started Goulet Pen Company. Had to buy it in huge quantities. It was pretty expensive. I want to say it was like $12 or $13 per 100 sheets. That's pretty expensive. And it was not 3-hole punched, it was multi-hole punched. So it was made to accommodate standard and European or metric holes. So it literally had like 12 holes in the side of the thing. It looked really strange. So it was really just not super ideal. They do have it. Clairefontaine has a French catalog that's got like, I don't even know how many products in it. It's a lot, like 7,800 products or something insane. So they've got all kinds of customizable notebook systems in there. I think there's one called the Claring or something like that. I don't know if that's been discontinued or not, but there are some systems out there. I'm actually not the expert on that, but I know in terms of what they regularly offer in the US, it's not very extensive, so I'm sorry. Rose H on Facebook said, I'd love to know an ink that will go well with the new blue-green Lamy All-Star. Yeah, so there are definitely some good ones here. Diamond Soft Mint, I think, is the one that around the shop here that we've all been liking as paired up with that pen. Diatramentus Mint Turquoise is another one that's pretty close. A little bit darker version is Pelikan Edelstein Jade, but that's a very nice color. It's a slightly darker than the pen. And then Jerbon Vert Reseda is also a pretty decent match as well. Now, of course, all that's going to depend on the pen nib paper and all that stuff, and lighting and your pen pressure and stuff as to how closely it'll match. But those are all pretty close. Carmen C on Facebook. Notice a lot of these questions are on Facebook today. I love Clairefontaine's paper. Any chance they'll make the cloth-bound notebooks, or any of the others really, with a dot grid? Seriously, who do I have to beg to make this happen? Well, sorry, Carmen, you can beg me all you want, but I'm not going to be able to do much for you. I'll pass the information up, but you know, when it comes to Clairefontaine or really any paper manufacturer, they tend to move along pretty slowly at changing things. You know, it's rare for paper companies to kind of, you know, lead the field in terms of innovation. They tend to just kind of move at their own pace. You know, one exception I can think is Field Notes. You know, they change up the designs of their notebooks quite a bit, and they're one of the ones that really try to experiment. They do seasonal notebooks, so they're changing things all the time, but that is not super typical. You know, when the dot notebooks came out in, oh gosh, when was that? I think it was in 2010. I don't remember exactly, when the Rhodia came out with the dot pad in the US. I loved it. I thought it was great, and I was encouraging them, like, you got to put this in everything. Like, dot is awesome. Why would you even use a grid notebook anymore when you have dot? However, the grid, some people still prefer it for whatever reason, and they haven't really expanded the dot all that much, not nearly what I would have thought. And there's no Clairefontaine product that I'm aware of that has a dot in it, at least not anything that's in the US. Maybe there's something that they make that's in a dot, but I'm not aware of it, so I really wish I could tell you what to say here, but I'm sorry. Just, you know, Exaclair is the company that imports all the stuff from the US, and they have some influence with what products are made from Rhodia and Clairefontaine. So I would go to exaclair.com and see what they can, you know, see if there's a contact form or something, and write them just as a passionate, or well, actually Rhodia has a blog as well that you could also write on. That would be another good thing, because I know they pay attention to that. What is it? Rhodia Drive. That's what it is. Rhodia Drive blog. Go check that out and let them know about your idea. Loraine B on Facebook said, what's the most affordable Japanese fountain pen that I can get with an extra fine nib? I have a Lamy Safari with an extra fine, but I would like a finer nib. Any suggestions? I've only got a couple options because there's not a ton of them, especially inexpensive ones. The Platinum Desk Pen would be the #1 suggestion. That does have an extra fine nib, and it is pretty dang extra fine. The pen's kind of weird though. It's more of like a calligraphy, well, it's not really calligraphy, but it's more like a script pen, so it's like really long and tapered, and it does not have a really great cap, and it's a $12 pen though, you know, and it writes really nicely. It's a very fine nib, but that would be my first suggestion. And then also the Pilot Metropolitan currently only has a medium nib, which writes more like a fine. However, they are coming out with a fine nib, a Japanese fine nib on the Metropolitan, coming out here around the beginning of May. So that definitely keep an eye out for. I think that's going to be big. And then there's also the Pilot Penmanship, which is very similar to the Pilot Plumix, except that it has an extra fine nib. However, that pen is not available in the US, but I do see a lot of people talking about it online, so they're getting them somewhere. So look at that one. It's pretty cheap too, from what I understand. Michelle L on Facebook says, can you explain the differences between all the higher end Pilot models? I'm so confused. I'm speaking of the Pilot Custom Heritage 91, Custom 74, the Custom 823, and the Custom Heritage 92, etc. I'd love a discussion on prices, looks, nibs. Are they all gold? Okay, a lot of stuff here. So first let me say I'm not familiar with the Custom Heritage 91. I had to go and type it up and look at it, because you're right, like some of the Pilot naming is not extremely logical to me. I think part of it's because, you know, they do it in Japan, and maybe stuff makes more sense or gets translated, you know, different into English. I don't know, but their naming and numbering and stuff is not super logical. So that said, the Heritage 91, that's not a pen that's available in the US. So I had to research that one. I wasn't able to find a ton of information on it, except that it's a cartridge converter pen, whereas all the other ones you're asking about here, well, let me pull back a little bit. So it is a cartridge converter pen. It appears to look kind of like the Custom Heritage 92, not super surprising, except that it's opaque. The Heritage 92 is a clear pen. And the Heritage 92 has a piston filling instead of the cartridge converter. So I don't know much about the Heritage 91, so I'm sorry I won't be able to help you out there. However, if you go and check out my video review of the Pilot Custom Heritage 92, in that pen, not only do I fully cover what the 92 is all about, but I also directly compare it to the Custom 74 and the Custom 823. So that video right there will cover all your bases and give you everything practically that you need to know. But I'll repeat a little bit of it right here. So basically, they all have gold nib. The Custom 74, the Heritage 92, and the 823, all gold nib. So they write great. They have a little bit of a springiness to the nib, flow really nicely. The fine nibs tend to be really fine because they're Japanese. The mediums tend to be a little bit on the fine side, but a little more conventional, and the broads tend to be pretty standard broad size. So it's not like a straight, like everything just take a step down in size because it's Japanese. Generally speaking, with my experience with the Japanese brands, is the finer nibs tend to be more on the fine side, and as you go up in broadness, it goes to more like a normal kind of European, not normal, but you know what I mean, European nib tends to be similar. The mediums and broads tend to be a little more similar to European ones. The Custom 74 is a cartridge converter pen. It uses the Con 70 converter, that big button filling one, which is kind of neat. I've got some videos on that. You can look up the Con 70 on my Goulet Pen Company channel there. And then Custom 74 is like one of my all-time favorite pens. I just love the way that thing writes. And the Custom Heritage 92 writes very similar. The nib and the feed and all that is the exact same on the Heritage 92 as it is on the Custom 74. But why is the Heritage 92 so much more expensive? I guess it's that piston mechanism. The Heritage 92 has a piston filling mechanism, but it's very similar in size and shape and everything to the Custom 74. It's not identical, but it's very similar, but it's more expensive because of the piston. And then lastly, the Custom 823 is larger, it's a heavier pen, it's got a larger nib, and it's a vacuum filling pen. So it has a higher ink capacity, it's really cool in the way that it fills. Go on YouTube and just look at custom 823s, and I've got a couple of videos on those as well. Michelle Y and Matt Z on Facebook had kind of a similar question, said basically, what do you do if your new pen has poor ink flow? So there's a couple of things that you can do. So this is a little bit different than the scratchy nib thing I addressed at the beginning of the video, but if your pen is not flowing well, first thing to do, because it's really just because it's the easiest thing, is to try rotating the pen a little bit in your hand, okay, and try moving your hand up and down and just kind of moving it all around and see if maybe you're holding the pen at some angle that the pen just doesn't like, and moving it around and really see excuse me. See if you can just get that pen to write well at all, even if it feels like a really funky angle. You know, just try it out and see if maybe there's you know, it could be a sweet spot on the pen that you need to hit, and that would be the first thing, just because it's the easiest to try. Make sure that you got a full filling on it, because I know sometimes you could think you got a full filling, but you got some air bubbles or something in there. You may need to, you know, if it's a cartridge converter or a piston, you can, you know, screw down the piston a little bit and force some ink down through the feed to pop any of those air bubbles, or just to make sure that your feed is properly saturated. And that would be the first thing to try. You can also try, if you have any brass sheets. So I've got a video on Goulet brass sheets. You can use those. They're very, very, very thin brass sheets that you can use to floss in between the tines of your nib. That's one technique that you can use kind of in tandem with just cleaning your pen. Make sure that your pen is really cleaned. If you haven't cleaned it in a long time, and you've been, especially if you've been changing ink colors without cleaning in between it, inks can mix and match in there, and if they don't like each other, then they can, you know, have chemical reactions and stuff that might clog your feed. But definitely, even if you've been using the same ink over and over and over again, if you haven't cleaned it in a while, stuff can build up in there. You get dust, you get paper fibers and stuff like that that kind of gets into your feed. It's always a good idea just to clean it out pretty regularly, you know, and then especially when you're changing ink colors. But even still, just give it a thorough cleaning, because sometimes if it's a new pen, you might have machining oils that are in there. You may have some little debris from the feed that was cut out, or just some part that was manufactured in the pen. So it's always good idea to give it a good flush, even just with clean water, but you know, clean water and dish soap or something, or maybe a pen flush if you have it handy. Let's see here. I have a video on Fountain Pen 101 pen cleaning and maintenance. So that's a good one to check out to see exactly how I recommend cleaning your pen. Try a different ink. Sometimes it could just be the ink that you're using, okay? So I don't know why, but for some reason some pens just don't like some inks, and they just have problems with each other. So it's a good idea to just try mixing it up just to see if you can eliminate as many variables as possible. See if the ink maybe isn't a good match for that pen. Try a different paper too. Sometimes if paper is really heavily coated, the ink and the paper will have some kind of weird reaction and they may not like each other. So try just switching up paper. Try it on different ones and see if the flow changes at all as well. Another thing you can do, this is a little more extreme measure, but if you want to actually try to increase the flow of your pen, you can actually press down a little bit on the tines to spread the tines a little bit. And it's easy to overdo it, so don't go too nuts. But that is one technique you can use to increase the flow just a little bit. But I wouldn't go too nuts doing that because it's easy to damage your nib beyond repair, and it's not easy to fix that. And then the last resort, you can either send it in for repair from a professional, or, if it's a relatively new pen and you're still within kind of the return period from wherever you bought it, you can look at returning or exchanging it for another one. So that's kind of the rundown that I usually do with a pen that's having flow issues. Michael L. on Facebook said, what empty inkwell would you say has the widest opening? Is there any ink bottle you would recommend that would completely fit an oblique dip pen holder? I'll be honest with you, I don't use any oblique dip nibs, so I can't say definitively, but off the top of my head, the ones that have the widest openings, I'm thinking Caran d'Ache, the new Caran d'Ache Incredible, Chromatics Incredible bottles, those have a very wide opening. The Schaefer bottle has a pretty wide opening as well. Let's see here, Monteverde also has a very wide opening, and Stipula has a pretty wide opening too. I'm trying to think what else off the top of my head. I meant to look this up ahead of time and I didn't, so I'm having to kind of think of it on the fly. Private Reserve has a very wide opening as well. That would be another one to consider. Pilot Iroshizuku is not too bad. It's not quite as wide as some of those other ones, but it's still pretty good. I think between all of those combinations, you should be able to find something that works pretty well for you. And then Emily P. on Facebook said, are all fountain pen users hobbyists, or are there some random users? Which I just love that term, random users. Someone in a class of mine was using a fountain pen to take notes. I wanted to talk to her about everything fountain pens, but I worried that she might not be involved with the hobby of it, or if she was just using one randomly. Well, I'm picturing somebody just sitting there and then a pen just like falls into their hand and they start writing with it uncontrollably. That's what I picture. But I mean, obviously, if somebody's using a fountain pen, it's not completely random. I mean, they have to know generally what they're doing with that pen, at least how to fill it and how to use it on some level. And because fountain pens are so atypical these days, if someone is using one, there's going to be some kind of story about why they use it or where they got it, or even if their story is, yeah, I just found this pen on the street and thought I would start using it, and it's really weird and I'm getting used to it. There's still a good conversation to be had there. So I would say, don't just go in there and start, blah, here's everything I know about pens, but just start a conversation and just say, hey, that's really interesting. You got a fountain pen. I got a fountain pens too. And a lot of people around here use fountain pens. How'd you get into it? Are you really into it? Have you been into it for years? You're going to start asking some probing questions to kind of gauge, how much they're really into it. But in general, I would say that aspect of the fountain pen hobby is one of the kind of neat, the cooler aspects of it, because I'll get emails from customers all the time that say, you won't believe it, but I ran into someone on the subway and I noticed that they had a Lamy Safari in their pocket, and I pointed it out and we got into this 15-minute conversation about fountain pens. So it's kind of this neat little thing that you just run into people randomly who use pens, and because it is so random that you run into someone that uses them, because so few people do in the grand scheme of things, there's always kind of a neat story, a neat connection to be had with that person. So it's a great conversation starter. So I would say, next time you see that person, just go up to them and say, hey, I noticed you're using a fountain pen. That's pretty cool. Do you know much about it? Can you tell me, how did you get into it? And then you can just gauge a conversation from there. Well, that's all the questions I got for this week, so thanks for sticking with me. I know this was a little bit longer one, but I'm trying to make up for lost time because I'm so behind on videos, and I'm sorry about that, but I am working on it, I promise. So next week, I am going to be skipping Q&A. I'm really sorry, but my workload is intense, and so I'm trying to only do the Q&As when I can really do them well. So that said, I will miss next week, but I'll be back, and then after that, I should be pretty good. I won't be going anywhere for a little while. So April 18th, I will be skipping, but I will be back on the 25th. And because this week is an open forum, I'm going to go back to a brand theme for the 25th, and that theme is going to be Pilot. So if you have any questions about any Pilot pens or Pilot ink, I know it's going to open me up to all kinds of stuff that's not offered in the US, because Pilot does have a lot of pens that are only in Japan. So, you know, I'll just take those as they come. But whatever questions you have, you can find, you can leave a comment on YouTube here on this video, on Ink Nouveau as well. You can email gouletqa@gouletpens.com. You can hashtag gouletqa on Twitter. You can find us on Facebook as well. Lots of different ways to get a hold of us and submit your question into me so that I can answer it for the next Q&A. So that said, I hope you have a wonderful week. And, well, wonderful 2 weeks for that matter. You know, enjoy yourself, enjoy your pens, and as always, write on.